Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com and welcome to my Express Masterclass. What we're going to be doing in this video is working with Express and learning about the core of Express. Now, you can do a lot with Express once you start bringing in other libraries, but here we're just going to focus on sort of like just what Express does by itself. And basically what Express is, it's a web framework, and web frameworks are built to make web servers. So these are your backend servers, the servers that basically deal with APIs, handle HTTP requests, all these kind of things. Okay, so I have created this new folder, Masterclass here. I'm going to clear my terminal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch a file called server.js. It really doesn't matter what you call the file. Server.js is just the convention because the application we're building is a web server. So it makes sense that the file that kickstarts this whole thing is called server.js, but it could easily be whatever. Now, since we're using npm, we want to do an npm, create a new npm project. So it's npm init-y, and this will create a new package.json. Package.json keeps track of our project, our node project, and a couple things we want to install is I like to always install Express. That's what the library we're playing with. And I also like to install Nodamon. I always like to install it locally. Some people install it globally. Actually, ideally the way I installed that, let me uninstall Nodamon. npm uninstall Nodamon. Because ideally you should install it as a dev dependency. So notice how like when I installed it, they had originally both showed up here in my package.json under dependencies. That's what happens when you install libraries in Node. But dev dependencies are dependencies that aren't used when you actually like deploy the project. They're just used for when you're working in your development space. So to save it that way, I would do npm install --save -dev Nodamon, and you'll see it'll get a separate distinction. They'll create a new section. See, dev dependencies. So I still have Nodamon, and the beauty of Nodamon is like usually if you do something you run a file in Node. It reads the file into memory. So in that case, any changes you make aren't reflected. So what Nodamon does, it's going to watch your files in case you make any changes, and then it just reruns the file. So that way, basically, I'm going to say, hey, run server.js, and anytime I update the files, it'll just rerun server.js. So that way, it's reflecting the changes. Not good for production, because you don't want your server randomly restarting when it's deployed, but you do want to restart it when you're making changes in development. This is why typically we take advantage of this script section. Okay, we'll create two scripts. One, we want our production script, which is conventionally in Express, or really in Node, your start script. So start, we're going to say node server.js. So that's how we want to kickstart our server. You run the server.js file, even though it does nothing yet. And then we want a dev script that is going to kickstart things inside of our dev mode, which is going to use Nodamon to run server.js, so that way as we make changes, it'll automatically like rerun the file. Cool. So this is just like setup, and again, point of package.json to show us what our dependencies are, to be able to create scripts. So I can create as many scripts as I want that do whatever I want. Okay, all I have to do is do npm run and then the name of the script. So npm run dev would run the server.js. Okay, but for now, let's actually create a basic server. So how does this work? Now that I've installed Express, I have to actually import Express into the file. And the way you gotta think about Node is that every file is its own island. So if I didn't import it into that file, if I didn't create a variable by that name, it doesn't exist in that file. Okay, everything has to be manually sort of connected but through imports and exports into each other. So what we're going to do is we're going to import Express because I installed it. But just because I installed it doesn't mean I can use it yet. I got to actually tell Node in the file saying, hey, I want to grab this thing that I installed. So I'm going to say const express equals require express. Okay, there we go. Now I have Express. Now this Express thing that I just imported is actually a function. And it's a function that allows you to create an application. So we want to create an application object. Const app equals express. And this creates now this is our application. This app variable here. And essentially all Express does is that it chains together a bunch of middleware. That's literally all it does. What's middleware? Well, what a web server does, it listens for requests. It's listening saying, hey, did somebody ask me for something? Think of it like a waiter. Okay, so it's listening for orders, and then it executes those orders. Okay, these are called requests. Now, when a request comes in, it has a certain order of things it's going to do. This is your middleware. Eventually, so right now, what I could do is that every middleware function you can trigger through this app.use function. What this means is register a middleware function. Okay, so right now I'm just going to register it globally just to kind of illustrate the point. And every middleware has a signature, rec res nex. Okay, rec stands for the request. So anything about the request is going to be inside this object. Res stands for the response. Anything about responding to that request is inside res. And then next allows you to go to the next piece of middleware. Okay, it allows you to go to the next thing in line. So what we're going to do first is we'll just send a basic response. So basically what this is going to do, we'll say res.send, so res is the response object. So I'm saying respond now using the send function, which just could send text, could send whatever. The send function, what it does, it dynamically figures out what you're trying to do. So if you send just like a string, it's going to send it as text. If you send an object, it'll send it as JSON. If you send HTML, it'll send it as HTML. So if I do this, like h1, hello world, it'll pick up on that there's HTML tags in here, and then send the appropriate response headers, so that way the browser knows this is HTML. Okay, cool. So right now, when a request comes in, it's just going to go directly to this middleware, and no matter what I request, it's going to send back hello world. That's essentially what's going to happen. But for this to happen, my server needs to be listening, so I have to create a listener. So that's what this listen function does. It says, hey, I want you to listen on port, we'll say on port 2000. And there's up to a little bit over 65,000 ports that you could possibly use. Fun fact, the reason why it's 65,000 is because, to be more specific, it's 65,535, is because technically it holds the port number in a 16-bit integer, and the highest number you can hold in a 16-bit integer is, so it's just because of the limitations of the space they have to hold the number. Cool. You're never actually going to have 65,000 ports running because your computer, well, maybe if you have a really, really, really fast computer, but probably in your development environment, you're never going to have like 65,000 things listening to all these ports. So let's choose something random, 777. Okay. Yeah. So there we have port 7777. After the port number, we can also send a function. And really the purpose of this function is really just like this function runs when the server starts listening. So it's usually used just to kind of create a message. Console.log listening on port 7777. Okay, cool. And that's it. Like right there, we have a server. That's it. Okay. Express was imported. We created an application object. We created one piece of middleware. And here we are listening on port 777. So let's go to my terminal. Let's run that dev script. npm run dev. That's going to run the dev script. And see, it's Nodamon's listening. So anytime if I hit save, see, it restarts the server because it knows a change. Okay, so now I'm going to go over here and let's go to localhost 7777, and I get back hello world. Cool. And here's the thing, I can go to anything long as, because that server is always going to respond the same way, the way I wrote it. So if I were to do /cheese, hello world. If I were to do blah 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 blah, I get hello world, because I didn't specify any particular path or anything. This middleware is going to work for everything. Now let's change this up a little bit. Let's pretend there's a second piece of middleware. So we'll make another piece of middleware, app.use, and we'll say, and then this middleware, res.rec.next equals, and this time what we'll do is we'll use res.json. Okay. And what res.json does is that it just takes whatever I put in here, it could be an array or an object, and sends it back as JSON data. Problem is, it's right now it's never gonna. This is never gonna work because this is already sending a response. So what I'd like to happen is that this middleware runs, and then it's gonna go to this next middleware. The thing that triggers that is that next. So I'm gonna say console.log middleware 1. And then after console logs middleware 1, we'll go to the next thing in line. Okay? Cool. So let's try that again. I hit refresh. Res.json is not a function. Why not? Oh, because I typed this backwards. It's rec, then res. There we go. Let's try that again. And see, we got back the array as JSON. Okay. But if I go back to my terminal, see, I see like middleware 1. Because I made a request, it went through this middleware first, so console log middleware 1, then next said, okay, it goes to the next thing in line, and it goes to whatever the next app.use is. Okay? Cool. Now, I can make it where it only works. Now, app.use can be a little bit more flexible. I can say, hey, I want... Let's say I make one app.use right here in the middle, app.use, and I can pass in a first argument that specifies a path, being like, it has to match this. So we'll say /cheese. If the URL is /cheese, then this middleware will do a thing. So again, rec res. And I'm not going to even bother adding the next because I'm planning to send a response. So this is why a lot of times you don't see that next because you don't intend there to ever go to the next spot. But we'll show you something else. We'll say if it's /cheese, what we'll do is we'll res.json again, and this time we'll send an object with the key of hello and say world. So now let's watch what happens. So if I hit this, I still get the array. See, I still get the array because it's not /cheese. But since now, if I go to /cheese, I get hello world. Because basically, this is going to keep going until it finds a response. So right now, first it goes to this first piece of middleware, console logs middleware 1, hits next, next goes to the next piece of middleware, which, again, this one will only work if it's /cheese. So in that case, it skips that one, and then goes to this one and be like, okay, well this one works, and this one sends a response to that. Now, when the /cheese, it stops here because this one sends its own response. So the idea is that this keeps going until, but what if you would never hit a response? Like, let me change this one, where this would only work on /yellow. Okay? /yellow. So if I were to go to something like /bread, I get this, cannot get bread. Why? Because what happens, it sent the request to our server. See, the middleware 1 still ran. So it runs that first middleware. It hits next. It checks this one, not /cheese. It's not /yellow. And then that's where the list ends. So in that case, what it says is like, hey, there's no response for this. We went through the whole list of things and none of them sent a response for this particular request. So I guess I cannot satisfy a GET request because that's a method. We'll come back to that in a second. And for bread. Okay. So that's another thing we can do. So let me see if I can, let me modify this yellow one. So that method, that whole get thing, the browser always by default makes a get request. Okay, it's always, doesn't matter what URL you type here, it's always making a get request to that URL. But let's say there's other types of methods. And that's all stored in this request object. So I can do something like this. I can say, hey, if, or I could do something like this. I could do a switch and say if rec.method, and then test it against several possibilities. So I can say, you know, case where it's a get. Why didn't I like that? Oh, I see. I didn't wrap this in. Let me just delete all this. switch statement. Okay, the first case will be if it's a GET request. Then it's going to say res.send. This is a GET request. And then we'll do a case if it's a POST request. Res.send. This is a POST request. And then we'll just do a default case, which means any other possibility. Res.send. This is some other verb. Okay, so basically, now we have to satisfy two conditions. It has to be /yellow, and it'll be handled by this middleware will be hit, or a route will be routed to this middleware. And based on our switch, I can use this rec.method variable that's inside the request object and undo all this. Okay. Now you'll see later on this is really not the way to do it, but the idea is to show you like how all this kind of works. Okay, so get, post, default. So the thing is that how am I supposed to test a non-get request? So I can type in /yellow here in the browser and see it says this is some other verb. Interesting. So I should have hit that get case. So let's test out why. Let's console.log rec.method. Let's make sure that I'm not confusing the spelling of the method. Oh, that shouldn't go there. That's inside the switch. Above the switch, console.log. So I will refresh. Let's see here. Okay, so see it's when it gets a method, they're uppercase. So I got to change these to uppercase. So always console log your variables if things don't work the way you think they are, because oftentimes data is not what you think it is. So now that I fixed that, let's see if it works now. Yep, this is a GET request. But how would I test POST? I can't make a POST request from the browser. Well, that's where Postman and other similar pieces of software like Insomnia, etc., come into play. So I would go in here and say /777. Let's just test it out. Make a GET request, and I get an error because I didn't make any route for just that. So make a post, a /yellow. So I'm saying, hey, make a POST request to this URL. And this is the POST request. Because at the end of the day, like, it ignores this part. This part's just telling it, like, where it's about just finding where the server is. What Express is going to look at to determine things is really this. This is what's referred to as the endpoint. And so you'll see, this is a POST request. Now, if I make something like a copy request, say I get this is some other verb. So at the end of the day, I'm just using these variables to, like, figure out what I should do in what situation. Now, there are frameworks where this is exactly what you would do. You would just do a switch inside of like these app.uses, but that can get really messy. So usually you don't use app.use to handle your requests. You usually use them strictly for middleware. Usually. Okay, so let's comment all that out. Because Express offers you some functions to make it even easier, where you don't have to type app.use and then make a switch. Like if you really just wanted it to work for a GET request, you can do app.get. Essentially, this is really just app.use that checks whether it's a GET request or not. That's all it is. It's at the end of the day, everything in Express is middleware. Everything is just these functions, and you're just saying what order do you want these functions to run. That's literally all it is. You're just saying I want when a request comes in, I want this to happen first, this to happen second, this to happen third, this to happen fourth, until a response is sent. That's it. Okay, so this is going to be much easier. I can just say /yellow, and I can again do rec res. I could do next if I want to, because actually I could write multiple functions here, but let's not get fancy. Rec res, and just say res.send, and we'll just send an object where with the method, so we can see some of the things inside the request object, such as rec.method. Queries, rec.query. There's a bunch of information inside this request object. So let's take a look at this so far. Okay, now we haven't talked about this rec.query. It's just another property of the request object. But let's see what happens. So I'm going to go back here, /yellow, because it's a GET request. Again, I specified this is app.get, which means this is a GET request to the endpoint of /yellow. I can hit enter, and I get this. And notice queries is empty. So how do you add a query? Where do queries come from? Queries that can just be arbitrarily added at the end of any URL. They always start with a question mark, and then you just do key value pairs. So we'll say cheese equals Gouda. Then you use an ampersand to put another one. Bread equals rye. And umbrella equals wee. Okay, and so each of these pairs are a different query, and they all get added to this queries object. And see, cheese, bread, umbrella. Okay, so that's what rec.query is. It's an object of any queries that are ended to the end of the URL. Queries are great when you're trying to give the user some flexibility over your API, so that way they can like specify, hey, I'm searching for this, or you know, customize what they get back. But usually, if you're trying to control things from your end, you're going to use URL params. Okay, and how does that work? Well, what we do is we can go to /, and again, your endpoint can have as many of these sort of sections as possible. So I could be like yellow.cheese.blue, whatever. Well, let's say I want one of these sections to sort of be a variable. Like I want it to like be different at different times. I can designate that with a colon. And that colon makes that section of the URL a variable. So in this case now, cheese is a variable. That part of the URL, whatever it is, will be stored in a different part. So we'll say params. It gets stored in rec.params. This is the object from, this is a property from this request object that holds these params. Now watch what happens. So I'm going to change this URL. And what was it again? Now it's like /cheese/blue. So it's now yellow / now if I type in whatever word, because the cheese is the variable part, so I'll just type in toodles/blue. Okay, notice this params now has cheese / its toodles. So it looks like toodles is inside the URL, but I never wrote toodles here. But because of that colon, it knows that this part is the variable. Toodles is where that would have been because it's yellow / the variable /blue. So it picks up on that, and I called it cheese, so it knows that it's going to call it cheese in this params object. Okay, so it's just another way to store information. The idea is there's different ways for you to send information to your routes, so that way your route can figure out what it's doing. Okay, and for GET requests, those are really the choices you have. Okay, for GET requests, really it's going to be queries, params. That's what you have. Okay, but if we make a POST request, or literally any other kind of request, you have a couple other options. So let's make a POST request to the same endpoint, except now we're going to add a couple other properties. We'll have a body, rec.body, and we'll have headers, rec.headers. These are just other parts of the request object. And again, you can send information via these different ways of sending information. So I'm going to send a body here. I'm going to send it as JSON. So in Postman, I'm just going to say, hey, I'm going to make a post request to /yellow /tuba /blue. And again, tuba, that's the variable part. That's the cheese part. Okay, I'm going to send it raw and as JSON. Okay, now let's see what happens. Now I get back, and I get back the headers. Here's the headers, but where's the body? I don't see the body. The reason is Express doesn't automatically assume what the body is going to be. Is it going to be JSON? Is it going to be XML? Is it going to be form data? So you have to set up middleware to look for these things. Express has it built in. You just have to like turn it on. So what you do is you trigger a piece of middleware before your route. So app.use, again, app.use is how we register middleware, and they run in the order that they're registered. So Express has this middleware called JSON, express.json. And what this will do is that if you send over JSON data, which I did, because again, I'm saying I'm sending over JSON, and what's happening is technically here in Postman, when I specify that I'm sending JSON, it's adding this header. So if I go here, like actually if I go back to here, I see this header, content type, application JSON. That header is what that middleware is looking for. If it sees that header, so it actually under the hood, whoever made that function checks to see, hey, is there a header called content type? Is the value of that header application/JSON? And if it is, it's going to go parse that body. And now watch what happens now that that middleware is turned on. And see, now we see this body here. Okay, cool. But what if I send it over as a different type? Like, what if I send it as form data, which is this xww.form URL encoded type? So we'll just say, you know, cheese equals bread, whatever. That's one thing. Now I hit send, and see the body's empty again. Why? Because this is not JSON data. If I look at the headers, so I go back to the headers again, look at the content type. Here we go, content type. See, it's no longer application JSON. It's application www form URL encoded. So if you ever use like an HTML form and use like the action property on the form tag, this is the kind of data that it's sending by default. So, well, Express has a middleware for that too. So we go app.use express.json, not JSON, URL encoded, and then you have to pass this object to it. Extended, true, doesn't matter, it's a thing you have to do. Okay. Cool. Now, let me try. So again, last time I sent the request, the body was empty. So if I send it again, I hit send. Okay. And see, now we see the body again because I have the right middleware that's looking for that right header. Okay. That content type header, that's URXWW. And I can send my own custom headers. Okay. So I can go over here in headers. So this is the headers section of Postman, and I can add my own header, cheese, a Munster. I hit send, and see it shows up in the headers section. Okay, so again, the point is there's just all sorts of different ways for you to send information, and you have access to all of it in any of these routes because they're all inside rec. So you define the request object here, rec, and you have rec.method, rec.query, rec.params, rec.body, rec.headers. Traditionally, headers are usually done for very specific things, and bodies generally sent when you're like creating and usually dealing with like adding form data to like add something to a database. And then params and queries usually do the bulk of the work. And usually you don't have to do much with methods because again, they already give you these like app.post, app.get methods that kind of take care of that for you. Okay, but notice like I have like 2 routes now that start with yellow. So that means every time I have to make another route, I'm writing yellow again. Okay, there is a way that we can avoid having to write yellow over and over again. What you can do is you can create a clump of routes. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file here. I'm going to create a new file. And again, how your files look like, there's a convention called models, views, controllers. I'm not going to get into right now, but you can organize your files any way you want. Express really gives you lots of flexibility in how you do this. Okay, so what really Express is just giving you the tools to create this chain of middleware to get a response. How do you connect to a database? Choose whatever database you want, and then just use the JavaScript library for that database. You want to do like HTML templating? Choose whatever templating library you want and bring it in. Express is minimalist. It's unopinionated. You use the pieces you want, which makes it a lot of fun. You can really customize it to what your project, to the tools you enjoy. But here we're going to say router.js. So this is what's called a router. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in Express. So const express equals require Express. You always have to import it. Just because it's imported in another file doesn't mean it's imported in this file. Okay, and then I'm going to create a router. Const router equals express.router. This is a function that creates a router object. Now a router object allows us to create a bunch of routes that are kind of as a bundle. Okay, and usually the reason you'd want to do this is because you have a bunch of routes that kind of start with the same name. They're related routes. So in this case, we're going to use this for routes that start with /orange. Okay. So I'll just make one route. And since I'm using my router object, instead of writing app.get, I'm going to use router.get. But same, literally works the same way. So I'm going to say router.get for slash recres res.send cheese. Okay. And then what I would do is I would module.exports. That's how you export things in Node. Module.exports, we would export the router. Okay, and I can now import that router here in my server.js. So I just import it. So let's say const router equals require dot slash router. So I'm just so what it's going to do is that this require function is going to import whatever is exported by that file. So since that file exported the router, this variable is going to end up holding the router. And now what I can do is I can add this in my middleware chain. So I'll put it before the other routes. App.use and say /orange. And say, hey, if a route starts with /orange, send it to the router. So these routes that are in the router will only be checked if it starts with /orange. That's why I did not have to write /orange here. Because right here, this did it for me. So now I can write all the /orange routes I want in here. And I don't have to be writing /orange over and over again. And plus, it allows me to keep sort of all the related routes sort of in one place, which is pretty nice. So let's try that out. Let's see if that works. So if I go to /orange, do I get that route? And I do. I get that route. Okay. And that's all this really is at the end of the day. You're just saying, if the request is this, here's what I want you to send back. If the request is that, here's what I want you to do. Literally anything you imagine, you can do. You just have to inevitably send a response. Okay, you could create a catch-all response. So let's say you want to do like a 404 page, like instead of having that cannot get, you can do something like this. You can do app.use. Or actually, I think there's an app.all. Yep, app.all. So that's for all. And then you just say a asterisk, which means all, anything, goes for anything. And then you just say, hey, rec res. And we'll just say res.send. This is not a route. Boo. And generally, you want to send something like that as an error. So you would want to change the status. And we'll change the status to 400. Because that means, technically, it should be a 404. 404 means, hey, this thing doesn't exist. And how would you memorize that? There's a couple different sites for memorizing that. There's like HTTP cat, where you can see all the different status codes as cats. There's also HTTP dog. Although that one's URL I always forget. Here we go. HTTP status dogs. And I'm not sure if there's any other ones. HTTP status animals. Any other ones? HTTP status cats. Cats. Yep. Mostly they only have cats and dogs. But if you wanted to get an idea of like what they mean, those are pretty fun ways to kind of see what they mean. But now let's try this again. Let's try to do something that doesn't match anything. Blah, 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 blah. This is not a route. Boo! Okay, so that's like a custom 404. And I can see if, did I get that 404 status code? Yeah, see, the server responded with a 404 status code. I can actually see the results of these different requests here in the network tab, which is really helpful inside when you're in the browser. So I can go here, boop. I can see it got back a status of 404. And the browser knows that a 404 is an error. Now if I go to orange, let's see what I get. Orange, and I can see 304. And I can click on headers, and I can see the headers on the way back. I can see like, hey, this is the URL I made a request. It's a GET request. Okay, I can see all those request headers here as well. This is really useful when you're having problems, far as a way of diagnosing. Like, this is probably my favorite part of DevTools, because oftentimes where you end up having the most errors is when you're just troubleshooting APIs and servers, and this making sure that your front end making the request right. And this is just great for finding those answers. Cool. Yeah, so we've seen how you can do params. We've seen how all these different objects that exist in requests, rec.query, rec.method, rec.params. We saw that we can use res.send and res.send and res.json. One last thing to show you is that you could set up a static server. That's another middleware that's built into Express. So if I were to do this, app.use, and I say express.static, and then I were to say stuff, that means it's going to look for a folder called stuff. So I can make a folder called stuff, and I can make like an HTML file in here. So let's say new file, stuff.html, and basically I'll just do some boilerplate here, HTML, just some gibberish. And now if I go to, it's going to treat this, like this right here is treated as my stuff folder because that's the static folder. And then what happens is if I type in stuff.html, it's going to look in the stuff folder for a file called stuff.html. And if it exists, that's going to be the response. And see, I got that back. Okay. Now, that's pretty cool. And if I were to put a folder in this folder, oh, actually, folder. Okay, cheese. And then inside that cheese folder, there's another file called bread.html. Okay. I could go to, let's try that. So I think it was it. /cheese/bread.html, I think it was. Yep, and there it is. That's pretty cool. Now where this gets more useful is like for like serving images or CSS files. So maybe you have CSS files that you want to host for your front end, but you don't want to but you want to not host them. You want to host them separately in your back end for some reason. Or you want to host images. You can host them here. You just stick them in this folder, and what it does is just basically based on the URL, it'll look for a folder that matches the URL, a file that matches the URL and serves them. So that's a really cool feature. If you've never used other web frameworks, it's hard to appreciate how easy it is in Express, because a lot of other frameworks make you go through a lot more hoops to get these results. It's pretty nice, and it's pretty fast. People talk about like Koa and Fastify as faster or slightly faster alternatives or having other benefits, but Express is pretty lightweight, and again, it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can use all sorts of templating languages. You can literally do anything. All it does is just say, hey, start a server. A request comes in and you tell Express how to handle it. And it can handle it in any way you want. And there's a lot more you can do beyond what I just said, but these are the tools. How you use those tools you can get really creative with. But essentially, that's the deal. The one last thing I'll show you is that a really neat trick is to use your middleware to add more properties to the request object. So one thing people sometimes do is we'll create a middleware, app.use. Okay, and we'll say put in the middleware function rec res next, and then they'll add let's say a context property. So we'll say rec.context. Okay, and then you can just add this object that has whatever data you want. So if there's certain data that you just want available to all your routes all the time, this middleware, you just say, hey, I want to name Alex Merced available. Since this middleware is ahead of all your routes, it's going to run before that, add that property to request, which makes it available to all these other routes. Because again, these run in order. So as request changes, it is changed for all the future pieces of middleware. So now if I add this to this one, so if I were to say rec.context, is that what I called it? Yeah, rec.context. Let's try that out. And that's like yellow. That was yellow. Then there was the param, so that could be anything. Blue. That's stalling. Porque. Oh, I know what I did. So see, when it stalls like that, it's because you wrote a piece of custom middleware and you forgot to use the next function. So you don't even get a 404 error back because the next function never ran. So it's not going to the next middleware, but this middleware didn't send a response, so it just hangs until it times out. So that was my mistake there. I forgot to put the next function. Okay, I'm see now it works. And see, there's the context. Okay, so that's more of an advanced trick, but it's a cool thing. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this, and it gave you some context on some of the nuances of Express. But Express is super awesome. Definitely one of my favorite frameworks to play with because it's just so flexible and nimble. You can just kind of do a lot of really cool stuff really quick. Yeah, so enjoy. I'll see y'all later.